This is a sermon map, and I'm going to show you how to read a sermon map in just 5 minutes. All right, on the left over here, we have about 50 different things that a preacher can choose to do during a sermon. And they're split up into three main lanes. The orange lane would be explanation, explaining the text. Green would be illustration. Blue would be application. The red line down here, the red section, that's presentation and delivery. It's best to map that separately, so we'll just focus on these three. Now, a sermon map is laid out from left to right, flowing through time. So there's timestamps up here, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. So if you're listening to a sermon, the way that a sermon map would flow is, let's say the preacher starts with prayer, which is line 4, you would just put a dot next to prayer. You could either do this with pen and paper, printing this up from the resource section of the website, or you can use this app called Notability that I use, and it helps you. It's a lot easier to use Notability. You can put the dots and the lines. So the preacher starts with a prayer, line 4, then let's say he reads his text, line 5. Then let's say he drops down and shares a dad joke. Well, jokes are line 30, an illustration. And then let's say he pops back up, shares a little background context information about like the city of Corinth or whatever he's preaching on. That's line 12. And then once you have the lines, either while you're mapping it or later, after you are done listening to the sermon, you start connecting the lines, and then you can see how the sermon flows through time. You can see how the preacher goes from explanation to illustration, back up to explanation. And then as the sermon continues, you'll see it flow left to right. It becomes like an EKG of the sermon, showing everything the preacher did minute by minute. Now, when you look at a completed map, then you can start to really draw some insights. So this would be a map here by Chuck Swindoll that we're going to look at, a completed map of one of his sermons from 1 John 5, 1-5. And every dot is something that he did. Here he shared some general commentary and inference to start it off. He shared an author profile of John, then some background context information, made a cultural observation about our world today, line 27, shared a quote or a stat, that's line 25. Then he jumped back up and just did some more general commentary. Do you see how left to right you can see how the sermon is flowing? Of course, he's a master at explaining the text. And what you want to look at when you're reading a sermon map is how a preacher flows within the lane and then among the lanes or between the lanes. So Chuck Swindoll flows within the lane here, and he hits a lot of different ways to explain the text. Verse by verse, word by word, he does some word studies here. He traces some themes here. And then up at the top, where you see these dots with circles around them, those would be main points. So if a main point comes up where it's clear and stated, you would put a dot and then you would circle it. In this sermon, he saved his main points for the end of it. But you can see an illustration, how he went to many different illustrations within the sermon. That's weaving within the lane. And then he also weaved between the lanes. He got down to application and he narrowed the audience down here and talked to certain groups of people. He also talked to people about their feelings. That's line 45. Their thoughts and questions. That's line 44. So you can see how this becomes an EKG. How did the preacher explain the text, illustrate it, apply it, and how did that flow through time? And you can see how reading a sermon map is not very hard. You can tell exactly what the preacher did dot by dot just by looking through this sermon map. If you would like to learn how to draw insights from sermon maps, then take 10 minutes to watch the next beginner course, which is comparing sermon maps. We're going to look at 4 very well-known preachers, including Chuck Swindoll. And when we put their maps side by side, preaching the same text, what happens if we look at 4 preachers preaching 1 John 5? How do their maps, how are they similar? How are they different? And how do styles emerge? And from that, you can start to draw some insights, some skills on how your preaching can go to the next level. So check that course out next.